Anyway, we are thrilled to have you all here for an exciting exploration into participatory budgeting, process of inclusive decision making for the allocation of public funds within communities. So, participatory budgeting, or PB for short, is renowned as a transformative tool that can empower citizens, boost transparency, and foster community engagement, which altogether brings exciting opportunities in its application in the Singaporean context. But what exactly is PB? Where does it originate? How has it evolved? And how do you actually do PB today? We have two speakers today that will talk about this, Professor Brian Wampler and Ms Anita Dos Santos, that will guide us through these questions and more, taking us on a journey from the beginnings of PB to the strategies for implementing PB in diverse contexts. Following this presentation, we'll welcome a discussant to share his insights and reflection of what has been shared, bringing the discussion into a Singaporean context in its feasibility and its application. And throughout the presentations, if you have any questions, feel free to type them in the chat below. We'll also have a dedicated Q&A session, about 30 minutes at the end, where we will address as many questions as possible. And you can also raise your hand function, press the raise hand function to ask your questions straight to the speakers straight. So now, without further ado, let me introduce our first speaker, Professor Brian Wampler, who is a President's Professor of Public Scholarship and Engagement at Boise State University. Wampler is a political scientist specializing in democracy, participation, and institution building, having conducted field research globally. His work is published in numerous top-tier journals, and he is also an author of many books on PB and democracy. In his presentation, Professor Wampler will share the evolution of PB from its beginnings in Porto Alegre, Brazil, to its current global applications. Over to you, Brian Wampler. Yeah, thanks.
Thank you so much. I appreciate the invitation to be here. I appreciate the opportunity to speak to the audience in Singapore. Welcome. Good morning, everybody. It's Tuesday morning. It's Monday night here in Boise, Idaho. We're in the mountain region of the United States. So sort of think about just to the west or to the east of Seattle and Portland. So what I want to do is first I'm going to share my screen. I'm going to do a presentation. So hopefully, can you see the screen? Okay. Okay, now I'm screen sharing. Okay, great. Thank you. So new democratic institutions in Brazil, deepening democracy, improving well-being, and the spread of participatory budgeting beyond Brazil. My research has been framed by almost 30 years of work in Brazil and currently in East Africa and other places across the world to really think about how new democratic institutions are adopted, how they're adapted to meet the local environment, and what impact they have. One of the key areas, this is sort of an empirical question that was asked to me years ago. I was doing field research when I was in Brazil, and a activist at one of the meetings, a community member at one of the meetings, she asked me, will this program make a difference in our life? How will these new democratic institutions improve us? How will we know if our programs are working? And so I took that question and it's been in the back of my mind. I've been rattling around that for a couple of decades, and I try to use the political science theory, public administration theory, in order to think about these questions. So at the broadest level, I'm really interested in the question is how do these new democratic institutions contribute to the deepening of democracy? How might they allow individuals to have greater voice, to establish accountability, to change how the government provides services, to expand what can be debated, what are the issues that are being discussed? The second issue is more strategic, more narrowly, is how have democratic institutions improve people's lives? In other words, can we find ways that governance is altered so that service delivery is better, or that there's some measurable ways that we can sort of say, okay, the democratic dialogue went from this abstract deliberation into actual policy that changed people's lives. And the third question is, how has participatory budgeting spread across the world? And then how has it changed as it has spread? The theoretical debates that I often engage in, and if anybody's interested, at the end, they can email me for articles or work. I'm really interested in issues about the quality of democracy, thinking about how you move, how you thicken the quality, how you thicken civil society, how you make people more interested in people become more interested in being involved in democratic processes. Theoretically, it's also within civil society. How are citizens and activists engage? How do they engage vis-a-vis each other, so within civil society, but how do they also engage with other moments, like the state moments? How do they engage with businesses? The third theoretical debate, you can think about Sen's work on Human Development Index, is really trying to think about improving basic indicators. And this is really an important one, especially in the global South. When we think about the quality of democracy from my viewpoint needs to really also be linked to tangible improvements in people's well-being. There needs to be a connection there where people can see that their involvement ended up improving people's lives. And the final theoretical debate is this diffusion, the adoption, adaptation, and I'll get to that in the third phase. So the talk today, which mirrors much of my research agenda, covers three phases. So what explains the variation outcomes? Some PB programs work really well, really high quality, others don't. And so I have spent my career trying to figure out how and why certain programs work better than others. And of course, success and failure or weakness of programs is very subjective, but we can start thinking about issues of the degree to which governments adhere to what citizens decide, the number of participants, the quality of participation, the amount of resources. So there's a series of criteria that we can establish just to say this program is successful. The second phase of today's talk is also this thinking about how PB may positively affect social change. And the third phase is the spread of PB across the globe. Okay, so briefly, I know Anita is going to go, the second speaker is going to go into this a little bit more, but I just put together a definition, a democratic policymaking process that brings together residents, community leaders, and government officials to deliberate over and vote on the allocation of public resources. What I want to draw your attention to is it includes ordinary citizens, residents who are not really active but are just showing up occasionally. It involves community leaders, the usual suspects, if you will, or people who are involved a lot, but it also involves government officials. These need to be combined in a single, these have been successfully combined in these debates together, sometimes in public formats, but sometimes in the ongoing process. I think it's a key aspect. Participants then directly decide on where public money will be spent. For me, this is what changed around, this is what PB did differently than other types of participatory program. It allowed the participants, residents, community leaders to vote, to then allocate how the government was going to be doing things. So this is a very different scenario from normal participatory programs that tend to be much more listening on the behalf of the citizens tend to speak, governments listens, but then governments don't necessarily act. This program, this emphasis on real decision-making really came about because Brazil was in this really innovative moment in the 1980s of democratic renewal and democratic change. It was coming out of a dictatorship. It was moving into this environment in which people were rethinking what the type of representative democracy they wanted to have. And this was a city-level process in which government officials said, well, for us to create a meaningful democracy, we have to turn over real decision-making power to the population. So the famous case is Porto Alegre, Brazil, that was mentioned. The first thing to note is in the first year, 1989, hardly anybody participated, 1,000 people. But then later on, you get this real buildup. the government starts to implement programs, people hear about it, it becomes really worthwhile. The program becomes more sophisticated over time. It attends to different types of needs. It starts off with just focusing on infrastructure, and then expands to create thematic areas. So as you're thinking about these sorts of programs in Singapore, it's good to think about the starting point is not where you would likely be in 5 or 7 years, but it's going to be an evolutionary process. Most PB spending in Brazil was in low-income neighborhoods, and this is another real important a point I want to make, is that the reason why is that the governments divided the city into regions, and each region got resources based on their level of poverty. The poorer region it was, the more resources they got. So it sort of inverted the classic way that resources are spent. Oftentimes, government spend more money in middle and upper middle income neighborhoods, and in this case, they actually allocated more money to lower income communities. Okay, so what I looked at is one of the key issues when I looked at this variation in Brazil was that mayors, the key point was mayors had to be willing to delegate authority. So I think you hear this in the context of the Singapore. And what this meant was, so why would mayors do this? Why would mayors give authorities over to citizens after they've just been elected? Part of it was that they wanted to reward the base, the people who vote for them. They wanted to build new constituencies. They wanted to brand the local government. So the party had an interest in supporting a new democratic institution. So that's really important. And citizens, importantly, really began to demand to have rights. They began to say, we should advocate for and on behalf of the rights for our neighborhoods. And so this really sort of became the most successful. When these two came together is when I saw the most successful cases of participatory budgeting in Brazil, as well as elsewhere in the world. So mayors need to be willing to take a risk to give citizens authorities, but citizens need to also be demanding. They can't be pliant. They have to be saying, okay, we want these particular set of rights. So what do we find in Brazil? And this is part of the reason why it spread. Low income people participate at a high level of area, greater numbers of civil society organizations, greater number of women participating. And so there was this real sort of real dynamic situation in which we could tell from early studies that it was working well. Okay, but there was key variation in the programs. Some of the programs in Brazil worked really well, and some of them worked really poorly. And so by poorly, I mean governments would hold meetings, but nobody would attend. Or governments would hold meetings, lots of people would attend, but they wouldn't implement any of the resources. So you begin to see that there's this real sort of significant shifts around the country within these PB programs. Which this led to this question that I have going back to where I started today is, why are some of these, what are the impacts? How do these programs matter? And so what we decided to do is we decided to do a large end study where we looked at all known cases of participatory budgeting and compare them to comparable cases, the paired cases that didn't have the programs, okay? And so what we did is we created a database that covered 20 years, 1989 to 2010. We had 283 cities in Brazil. We focused on healthcare as an outcome area, as well as taxation, where you got 2 areas where you can see short-term change. Because we were really trying to figure out, do these programs matter and how might these matter? Okay. In order to do this, we had a couple different research methodologies. One methodology is we developed what we call the PB census. So we kept track, and sometimes we had to go back and keep track of which programs had PB for how long over that 20-year program. Some cities never had it. Some cities had it for 4 years. Some cities had it for 8, 12, 16 years. So we did that. But then we also had to create a database that included to allow us to control for factors that you would also affect economic development, tax base, federal transfers. So we had to collect an extensive body of data in order to be able to compare these municipalities. So what did we find? Okay, so we found first is that cities that adopted PB spent more on health and sanitation, 6% more. Okay, how do we explain this? Well, governments that are opening themselves up to the population were discovering that people wanted better access to healthcare. They wanted healthcare clinics in their neighborhoods, and they also wanted more substantial issues done, structural issues that, in the case of Brazil, had to do with sanitation in low-income communities. We also find that there's an increased number of civil society organizations. And by this, we find that the more people who are participating ended up having this positive effect. It created sort of a positive cycle in which citizens began to register because it was in their incentive. And the third category is we see a decrease in infant mortality. Okay, we see this consistently across those places that have more participatory processes in Brazil. So why? This one's a little bit, the causal chain is a little bit longer here, but this is what we think happened, is people go to the meetings, they're demanding healthcare, they're demanding that healthcare clinics be built. The government spends more money on healthcare. They do healthcare clinics in poor communities. Young women, young families go to those healthcare clinics, and you have better results. You also have better prenatal care. You have better knowledge among the pregnant mothers. So you have this overall situation where infant mortality improves. Now we find that with participatory budgeting. We also find it, and I can share this in my 2020 book that looked at healthcare, that looked at councils more broadly across all of Brazil, that we find this very similar phenomenon, that more democracy resulted in better healthcare outcomes for low-income individuals. Okay, now this is really interesting. These are the same categories, but if you've had PB for 10 years. So here you have 25, if you've had PB in year 10, you spent 25% more on healthcare than in comparable municipalities. If you've increased by 19% the number of civil society organizations, and you had a 33% decrease in infant mortality. So in other words, institutionalizing PB, there's long-term effects, has these really, really positive effects. People are responding to the system, and when it gets put in place, the programs begin to really pay off. Okay. Now, the last one I'm going to do on this is thinking about, this is a governance issue. So how do governments respond? Well, municipalities that have PB collect 34% more local taxes than comparable municipalities that don't have the program. That represents a total of about 3% of all their revenues. And so this is controlling for economics, for region, for population size. And the reason we think it's twofold what's going on is this is based on interviews, this is based on qualitative field research, is we think first and foremost, governments are motivated to collect the taxes that are owed them. And the reason that they're motivated is the governments have opened themselves up to the population to say, we are willing to implement what you're asking. We're willing to do what you are, what your voice expresses in PB. We're willing to do it. And in turn, the municipality, in order to fulfill their commitment to the population, they need to raise more revenues. And they need to be able to have the extra resources in order to implement the housing projects, the healthcare clinics, all the other activities. The second reason that we think these municipalities raise more taxes is there oftentimes is an effort to by civil society organizations to get people to pay their taxes, their sales tax, their property taxes on time. And what that means is local governments are much more likely to, or the citizen population becomes much more likely to be willing to pay taxes. And you can think about this as a reciprocal relationship. If a citizen goes and believes that she has voice in a meeting and the government implements, that person becomes more amenable to complying with the responsibilities and rules that are placed on them. So paying taxes becomes much more amenable if people think the government is working with them. And you can see this increases, this amount of increases from 34 to 39%, okay? So these are some of the main factors that helps to explain the sort of shifts and impacts and well-being over time. Let me just do one more thing before I move on to the final topic, is we want to dig in a little bit more deeply about what might affect the actual social well-being effects. So we administered a survey to 115 cases. And what we found is that the rules and how the rules are set up matter, right? Democratic institutional rules matter. I mean, that's a major part of, you can sort of, for those of you thinking about sort of electoral politics or party systems, institutions matter significantly in democratic settings. So we found 3 rules that really matter. First is to create a social justice and redistribution rule set. In other words, low-income neighborhoods or a group that doesn't necessarily have access to policy gets additional opportunities to have resources allocated to them. So for example, in the city of Boston, in Massachusetts, they focus, and as well as in Seattle, Washington, they focus a lot on youth, right? The youth don't have access to policies. The local government doesn't do much. So they're trying to figure out how can the rules attend to populations that really are excluded from the normal group that gets resources from the government. The second thing that we found is it's really important to build policy knowledge among CSO leaders, community civil society leaders. That was more important than building policy knowledge among ordinary residents. And so among the community leaders, because we began to see them as these are the intermediaries between the government and the population. So these are your activists, these are your neighborhood leaders. If they understand basic budget issues or where there's budgeting opportunities or spending opportunities, that was a really important part of these process. The third rule that was really surprising to us that we found from the survey and we confirmed elsewhere is that the legislative branch, it was important for them to have a role. Okay, most of these programs, as you think about the previous section was we thought about like it's important for the executive branch to be willing to delegate authority, to give authority back to citizens. But there's a danger if the legislative branch isn't involved because they can undermine the process. The legislators, they can get jealous. They can think this is taking away authority from them. So having a role for the legislative branch is really important. Okay. Overall, PB has a positive effect on social indicators. We find this multiple ways. I just focus on infant mortality. One of the key findings in the second paragraph, it's better to have PB than not to have PB. Even when PB programs don't work well, they produce better results than municipalities that don't do them in the context of Brazil. And then again, so it's better to have PB with social justice rules or bringing in the excluded than not having PB, than having PB without those rules. So I think the last two are a couple of things to think about in terms of sort of why you might do PB and how it might be structured. Okay, switching gears here. So that was about 20 minutes in, and that's about 2/3 of the presentation. So I'm trying to stay on track. So as you probably know, PB has been one of the most successful democratic institutions that's diffused across the world. Started in southern Brazil. Today we find it in Paris, we find it in Korea, Philippines, we find it in Sub-Saharan Africa, New York City, Chicago, Seattle. It's all over the world. And so with two co-authors, Stephanie McNulty and Mike Touchton, we set out to try to explain what accounts for this variation, what accounts for the spread of PB. And then, we're really sort of thinking about the adaptation, because what's clear is PB has adapted significantly. We find, and we make this argument, is that we find that there's really 6 different types of participatory of PB programs that are really clustered by global region. So the first one is, think about empowered democracy and redistribution. These come in the newly democratizing democracies with heavy income inequality. Philippines, Brazil, Kenya are examples of this. Or actually not Kenya, sorry. I think I'll just stay with Brazil, Argentina, Mexico. So these are more Latin American democracies plus the Philippines. The second group that we see is deepening democracy through community mobilization. And these are really community driven. I'd say the United States is much more community driven than top-down government driven. So you see a lot of engagement by citizen activists, citizen organizers who are pushing this agenda. So I think this is much more North American as well as some European cases. A third case would be mandated, a third type that we found is mandated by the national government. So the national government issues a decree, all subunits have to do it. So the first case, the most famous case, is Peru, and there the government, in a reform effort, implemented PB. And what's interesting is in the Peruvian case, recent research is showing that those governments that did it a little bit better, the subnational governments that invested in it, did a little bit better, are having better social impacts, better social outcomes than those local governments that didn't really implement it. The third program that we see a lot of is digital participation. I think Paris has a significant part of this, where you're really doing a lot of the work on, you're doing a lot of the work around, you're doing most of the interaction, most of the selection of project is online. The benefit of that is more people are involved. You have greater number of people voting. The downside is there's very little interaction among citizens. There's very little face-to-face deliberation. And I know you're doing a series of learning, a series of speakers and talks over the next several months. So that's an important issue to think about, is how digital participation changes the configuration of programs. The fifth type that we found was social development accountability. This is really World Bank driven. So these are programs we see in mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, but also we see this in some places in Southeast Asia. But it tends to be really driven by the World Bank interest in accountable government, accountable populations, but also social development for the populations. And the last type, efficient governance, we see this in mid-sized cities, I think I would say Korea, but also I think in Germany, northern France, where you really have an emphasis on using tax dollars in the most efficient way. And this is one of the ways that's interesting. The first type, empowered democracy, tends to be ideologically more sort of like traditionally leftist, whereas efficient government tends to be more conservative, with a concern with a more efficient use of tax dollars. So the criteria we use, you can see on this next slide, we used 5 different type of participation: decision-making, the resource allocation criteria, local control of resources, and then who's driving the process. And so we use that type to really think about the spread. What is really clear is most programs have significant adaptation. So best practices are a starting point, but then people move quickly from them to figure out what are the local needs. So as you are in the context of Singapore, or people are thinking about this, the first question I would ask is, what problem are you trying to solve? And what problem is the government trying to solve? What problem are the citizens trying to solve? Are they different? Are they similar? And then when you begin to start thinking about what problem you're trying to solve, you can begin to think about, well, here are the rules we want to solve, or here's the rule set that we need to put in place. Or, for example, it may be that you want to have more people involved, but with a greater degree of engagement, greater sort of lesser engagement. So digital participation might be the best scenario. It may be that you're trying to reach a hard to reach population. So if there's, for example, a low income immigrant population in Singapore, how that, you know, South Korea does this, New York City does this. How could you design a program that goes to those communities where people live and do something that really addresses their needs? So I think the key that we learned, even though we have these major types, we also see an incredible amount of local adaptation to meet local needs. And so examples that I was thinking of for the context of Singapore are places like South Korea, Paris, New York City might be really interesting starting places for you to think about. I think earlier, you know, Montreal, Toronto might be interesting cases of, you know, major cities that are confronting some of the same issues that you want. Just to finalize, I've got about a minute and a half, so I'm trying to keep right on track, is I think the big takeaway is that citizen engagement can generate positive impacts, that it can be harnessed in a way that positively affects how governments act, can generate accountability, it can change how governments raise revenues, but it can also positively affect people's well-being. And I think that's one of the really important areas. I think a second conclusion that I take from this line of research is that promoting participatory institution appears to be justified. So that's a sort of a debate that went on for years, is like, does this make sense? And I think if you look at the evidence that my team, but also other teams have developed over the last 25 or 30 years, the evidence is clearly showing that participatory democracy are those places that have it end up having better outcomes than those places that don't have it. Number three, which is crucial, is having a local champion. It's really vital to have somebody in an influential position, like, you know, in a mayor's office or you know, governor's office, that's really advocating for these programs. That it doesn't have to be the individual, it doesn't have to be the mayor or the governor themselves, but it needs to be somebody who has some sort of decision-making authority that can build. I think the final point I want to make is that these institutions can build and strengthen communities, right? They can link people who, most people who participate don't participate in anything else. It can bring them together because they're deciding things about their local communities. And I think there's this real opportunity to strengthen communities through these programs. I'll leave this final, I addressed these already, but I'll just leave them up on the screen. So I think I'm out of time, but I appreciate you listening, and I'm happy to take any questions at the end of the night. Thank you.
Thanks, Professor Wampler, for the very, very enlightening presentation. You went through what is PB to how does it impact people's lives, and I particularly enjoyed the part where you talk about the different typologies of PB itself, and you gave us examples of each, and that was really, really very, very interesting. But now let's just move on to the next speaker. So our next speaker is Ms Anita Dos Santos, who is currently serving as the Advocacy Manager at Participatory Budgeting Project. Here, she works with various organizations to implement PB. She holds a bachelor's in Latin American Studies from Queen's College and is pursuing a master's in social work at Fordham University. In her presentation, she will discuss the tools, tricks, and guiding sensibilities for practicing PB. Ms. Anita, the floor is yours.
Hi, everyone. Good morning. I'm going to share my screen. Just give me one moment. Okay, let me know if you can see my screen. Wonderful. Thank you. Okay. Hi, everyone. It's so nice to be here with you. My name is Anita Dos Santos. Like Sahelia said, I'm the Advocacy Manager at the Participatory Budgeting Project, and I'm based in New York City. So I'm going to start off by giving a little introduction about participatory budgeting projects, so you know a little bit about where I'm coming from. PBP is how I'll be referring to our organization from now on. It was founded in 2009, which is when participatory budgeting came to the US in Chicago, and we've led, supported, or inspired almost every PB process in North America. We work with people to collaboratively transform democracy, and we're based kind of all over the US. We have staff in New York, California, and kind of some places in between. And what we do is we support folks to advocate for participatory democratic practices, especially participatory budgeting, but also including other things like civic assemblies, participatory action research, and all that good stuff. And we support folks to build capacity to actually implement, as well as kind of shaping the field, doing research and designing and teaching and all those kind of things. So what I'm going to talk to you about today is an introduction to participatory budgeting. Brian Wampler gave such an amazing overview. It was like taking so many notes. I learned so much. And I think that you'll notice there's a lot of overlap and some of the things that we are going, that I'll name too. I'll share some case studies with you, some best practices, challenges, impacts, and then some resources at the end. And I'm looking forward to the discussion afterward. So if you will indulge me before we get into the kind of meat of all of it, if you can just put in the chat how familiar you are with participatory budgeting. I think it would be nice for me to know, but I think also for those in the room, if there are folks that you don't know, I think it could just be nice to see you. So if you're on one end of the spectrum where you've never heard of participatory budgeting before being invited to this space, you can put a 1. If you've heard of it before, but you might not be able to explain it, you can put a 2. If you're a little bit more familiar, a 3. And if you think you're an expert, you know about tons of participatory budgeting processes, please put a 4 in the chat. And I'm going to open up the chat to take a look. Okay, I see lots of numbers coming in. Okay, awesome. Okay, this is really wonderful to see. I'm not going to dwell on it too much, but you can keep putting your numbers in, and just nice to know who's in the room with us. So to start off, I'm going to share a basic definition of participatory budgeting. So it's a democratic process where community members directly decide how to spend part of a public budget. It's not a consultation. It's also not just a one-day event. It's this annual cycle of meetings and voting that gets incorporated into the budget cycle. Let's get a little bit deeper to see how this is like a way that real people, in essence, right, can make real decisions about how to spend real money. So what you see on the screen now is the participatory budgeting cycle. So I'm going to review each phase, starting with what's on the upper left-hand corner, which is design. And so after a pot of money is identified, we start by designing the process. We form a steering committee with a group of folks who are representative of the community, people who work in government as well, who might be working to implement this process from the government side. And they come together to make decisions about what the process will look like. And so they'll make decisions such as who is eligible to vote, who is eligible to submit ideas, what makes a project eligible. And that can look like things like the funding source is restricted to infrastructure projects only. And so those are the ideas that are going to be eligible, or this is the amount of money we have. And so the projects need to cost no more than this amount, right? So they'll make those kind of decisions. They'll also make decisions about outreach so that we can have outreach strategies that bring in those folks who traditionally have not been invited. They're asking who's not here, who has not been at the table, who needs to be here, and what do we need to do to make sure that when they are here, they can participate. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we go along. So after we've designed the process, we open up for the community to submit ideas. And so idea collection can happen at in-person events. It can happen online, and a lot of places do both. So we collect tons of ideas, and then we'll take those ideas and go to the next.
Sorry, I think your slides are not changing. We're still looking at your first slide.
No way. Oh no, it doesn't.
Maybe just release it and
Can you see it now?
Yes,
we can see it now.
Okay, thank you so much. I just saw something on my screen that said that screen sharing was paused, but it's all good now, right? Okay, take it in, everyone. Take in the participatory budgeting cycle. So right now I'm on the upper right-hand corner, which is proposal development. And so we'll take those ideas and we'll gather a new group of volunteers who will come together to develop those ideas into concrete project proposals. And so they will consider need, feasibility, and impact so that everything that makes it onto the ballot can be implemented impactfully, right? And so as an example, this is a real idea that was submitted during the participatory budgeting process in a city on the West Coast in the US, Seattle, during their process last year, 24/7 bathrooms. And so the idea was to have public bathrooms available. And the volunteers during proposal development might ask questions like, okay, what parts of the city would a public bathroom be most useful? And how much does it cost to build one bathroom? And if we built this bathroom, what staff would be, what city department would be in charge of managing it, right? And maybe we need to meet with them to ask them about what the needs there would be, right? And so there's this research. Folks might go to different neighborhoods in the city and they might talk to residents. They might talk to staff at NGOs to ask them, what are you seeing as needs in this community? And so they'll do all this research to come up with a proposal that if it wins, it actually can be implemented. And so next, this is really exciting. We develop those ideas into proposals and we put them on a ballot so that the community can vote. And then folks vote. Just like in idea collection, we can do this in person, we can do it online, we can do it both. We can do it both ways. And ideally, we're bringing the vote to the people. And so in traditional elections, we need to go out, we need to go to our voting site. For PB, when we have in-person voting events, we can have them outside of schools. When parents are coming to pick up their kids, we can put them on busy streets, like outside of a subway station. We can put it in front of a supermarket so that the vote goes to the people. And this goes back to when we designed the process too, right? Thinking about who has traditionally been left out and how can we design outreach strategies that make it so that these people know that PB is happening and so that they can vote, right? And then next, this is the exciting part, we'll announce the winning projects. They'll become funded until the pot of money runs out. And the last step is evaluation. And so we'll evaluate the process to see if we met our goals, make some changes, and ideally have another PB cycle the following year. So you might be thinking this sounds really exciting, but how do we afford to do PB, right? Like what kinds of ways can PB be funded? And we like to say that if you can spend it, you can do PB with it. There's tons of different sources. I think the most common funding source that you'll see is from governments, right? So this can be from the city, county, state, federal level, but PB can also be funded from non-governmental sources like foundations and nonprofits. My organization, PBP, we've run an internal PB process funded by our individual donations, which I'll talk about a little bit later, discretionary funds from elected officials. And we've seen this quite a bit in the US, where even if an entire legislative body does not pass a PB process, some individual elected officials might have some wiggle room with their funding and might be able to run a process with their discretionary funding. Schools run PB processes. Public agencies, like we've seen a lot of departments of health, parks departments. In a little bit, I'll talk about a Department of Labor that ran a PB process. So those kind of public agencies. And then finally, police and carceral budgets, what we're seeing is a divestment from these police budgets and an investment into communities, where communities get to decide how to use this money to spend on what makes them feel safe. So I'm going to share a few case studies with you to help this come even more alive. And so you've got the kind of view from 75,000 feet, but I want to make it a little bit more real by sharing some examples with you. So I'm going to share 3 case studies. And the first one that I want to share is a PB process in Taiwan. And so this process was implemented by the Department of Labor. They launched a process involving migrant workers, really with a focus on migrant workers, I would say, from Indonesia, Philippines, Thailand, Vietnam. And the goal of this process was for them to use the funding that was allocated to decide on leisure activities. And some equity considerations that they've kind of thought about are inviting migrant workers to take part in a budget process that impacts their lives, right? But that they're typically left out of. Brian talked about this during his presentation, but kind of what successful processes bring people in who traditionally do not get to make these decisions, or who are traditionally left out, right? And so this is an example of one way to do this. In the US, we see a lot of processes where citizenship status is not a requirement for voting, in the same way that sometimes age doesn't have to be a requirement for voting, or previous incarceration status, right? Which in the US bars people from being able to vote, right? And so that there is no inherent reason when we're designing for equity why anyone should not be able to vote in a process. And so another kind of consideration here is the role that NGOs played in bridging this gap between government and migrant workers. And so by providing interpretation, conducting outreach, and addressing other barriers to participation, they make it so that this process was able to bring in more and more people. And so I want to share a video with you to make this come even a little bit more alive. I'm going to share 3 minutes of this video. It's a bit of a longer video, but I'm going to share 3 minutes, and there are subtitles in English on the bottom, and just enjoy. I'm going to make sure that I'm sharing sound. Okay, I am.
完成你的想法的话，那我们要经过怎么样子的过程呢？那这个过程就是像今天大家一样坐在这边，然后它会有一个像今天这样子的场域，能够让大家来一起讨论，说你想要什么，大家想要什么，怎么样子才是对大家都好的想法。那我们可以做哪样子的想法呢？就像是我们平常可以做的一些休闲娱乐或休闲娱乐的活动一样。
that we are say that we are not just a worker. We are not only a workers here in Taiwan. That we can show our talent being an OFW, Filipino migrant workers here in Taiwan. That we're not only focusing on our job. That we can share our talents, and we can show our the skills, the talents of Filipinos. Yeah, and then we are so very proud of it.
它不是只有各国语言飞来飞去，就是开始改变的声音，开始改变我们倾听移工的需求的方式，开始改变移工对政府提出需求的方式。就我听到的不是各国语，因为我听不懂，但是我觉得这嘈杂的声音是开始改变的声音，就这样就很棒。
Wonderful. I hope the sound was all right for you there. I share that video, I think to make human this framework, this concept, right? To show the way that folks really do get excited to share all that they have, right? This process generated so many different kinds of ideas, folks bringing in, because the focus was leisure activities, folks really tapping in to their culture and bringing it into this new space where they were. And I think the impacts go beyond the projects, as you could see folks in the room really getting excited to put their ideas on paper. And I think that impact on participants goes way beyond the projects that win. I'll talk a little bit more about that at the end, but I hope you enjoyed that video. So the next process I want to share with you is a school-based process. And so the previous one was implemented by the Department of Labor. This process, I'm going to share two actually in one here, was in a school and then a Department of Health. And so this is a city, Central Falls, Rhode Island, a small city here in the US of about 20,000 residents. And they were awarded this one-time funding, COVID relief funding from the government, $100,000. And the school district used these $100,000 to decide between students and parents how to spend this money on extracurricular activities. And so they did this over the course of a summer. And this is a picture of some of the students, as you can see, with their projects kind of displaying what they did. And this process was so successful that there were these ripple effects in Rhode Island. So the Rhode Island Department of Health implemented a process in this city plus a neighboring city using $385,000 with a focus on public health, right? With a focus on improving the conditions that help us become healthy. And another way to say this is a focus on social determinants of health, right? And so the winning projects in this process were a sprinkler water park and a campaign around mental health stigma. And I think Brian mentioned this during his presentation too, that PB processes can grow. I think this is a great example. These are two distinct processes, but we can see that they're very, very geographically close, and they have some overlapping community activists who are pushing these PB processes, pushing for this community-led decision-making to be used to decide how to spend this funding. The last process that I want to share is an organizational process. And I want to share about our participatory budgeting process here at PBP, which we call PB squared. And so PB squared is a PB process that we do. We open it up to our national network of partners and supporters, and we use a portion of our individual donations to fund this. And our definition for who can participate, or eligibility criteria, is just anyone who's committed to participatory democracy that's equitable, accessible, and significant. So those folks can submit ideas, they can serve as volunteers, the budget delegates who develop the proposals, and vote. And so I want to share, I think, a little bit of the impact or kind of the role that this process has played, which it's a way for us to engage our network. It's a way for us to say, hey, you donated to PBP. Do you want to take a part in deciding how we spend part of that money? So it's a way for us to engage that network, right? And it's a way for us to also continue gaining insights about PB. Part of our work is to conduct research and design and support sharing information about PB, right? So it's a way for even us to learn and be able to innovate. It's also a way for us to resource hard to fundraise for projects, like staff wellness was one of the projects that won, and that might be something that's a little bit hard to fundraise for, but submitted by a staff member during a PB process is something we can kind of develop. And how does this work? Or what are like two key kind of characteristics that help to make this work? I think the first is creating alignment. And so staff are an integral part of making sure that the projects that are submitted align with our internal planning, align with what's going on internally. And then another step is that staff consent to everything before it's put on the ballot to ensure that it can be implemented impactfully. And maybe you see some overlap here with what Brian was talking about in terms of getting that kind of cosign from legislatures, right? To make sure that there's alignment there so that folks are kind of walking in the same direction. And so after sharing a little bit of that, having you see what PB is, what PB can look like, what are some challenges? And so I'm going to highlight just 3, but there are so many. We're all humans trying a new thing, which is my first kind of point that I want to share, which is that PB is hard, can be hard because everyone is learning a new way of making decisions. And so when we think about decision makers, they're learning a new way to make decisions. Something that I hear often is, well, I'm an elected official. It's my job to make decisions about the budget. Why would I put that burden on my constituents, for example? And then in the same way, we also hear from folks in the community, well, what's the point in participating? I've participated in things before, but it never makes a difference, fill in the blank, kind of that kind of way of thinking. And I think one way that we can think about this, or a pivot that we can make, is when we talk to our decision makers, yes, it is your job to make decisions about the budget. And thank you so much for taking that responsibility, right? And PB is an opportunity to show your community that you trust them, that it's an opportunity to also learn what's important to them. And it's an opportunity to take money that would already be spent and spend it more efficiently and precisely, right? When we have folks who are closest to the issues, making decisions about the way that that's going to be spent, that's going to give us a different sort of information than we can get from a census or from a survey, right? The stakes are higher also. I think that makes folks more likely to participate. And then I think that communities too, there is some kind of education here on learning that, like, actually, yes, like I do pay my taxes, right? Or I'm fill in the blank, I live here, and I should have a say. And I think that it's about rethinking our relationship to power, rethinking our relationship to what it means to participate and to civic engagement too, right? Which is much more than just voting. Time and resources can be really scarce. And so if you're thinking that, wow, PB sounds really cool, but it sounds like it's going to take a lot longer than the usual way decisions get made, which is just a few people making decisions, you are correct. PB does take longer than just a few people making decisions. It's more time intensive. It requires more resources. It takes more time to do things collaboratively, right? I think one of the solutions to this is just to expect it to take longer, right? When we know that that's going to happen, we can plan for that. And what does that mean? If you're a decision maker and you want to implement participatory budgeting, it can look like setting aside budget for this implementation, right? It can look like being more expansive in your timeline to know that community is going to take a little longer to move than the way that things usually go. And if we want to see the kinds of beautiful results that we usually see, the impacts that we see, we need to do things in a different way. We can't do things in the same way and expect to have these beautiful results from this collective way of making decisions. And I especially want to emphasize this for folks in a pilot process. Pilot process, your first time doing anything, right? I think there's a lot of learning there that we can iterate for next time. And then finally, managing expectations from the beginning to end. I think that one thing that I hear a lot, probably the question that I get asked most frequently is, okay, I want to do PB, but I don't think we can because, I'm sorry, there's fireworks outside my window. Wow. I don't know if you can hear that, but one of the things that I hear a lot is, I want to do PB, but I can't do it because people are just going to want a roller coaster in the middle of the downtown area. Or if you're doing a school process, kids are just going to want a pizza party every Friday, and we just can't do that. And so what I say to this is, number one, let us take a moment to consider and to trust our communities to know what they want, right? And so we might think that, oh, kids are just going to want a pizza party, but actually what we see in school processes, for example, one of the most common winning projects in schools are bathroom repairs. Why is that? Bathroom repairs, that's so random. Well, when we think about who is usually making decisions about how much funding is allocated to repairing the student bathrooms, it's the school administrators, right? It's not the students. And what bathroom are the school administrators using when they're at the school? They're probably using the staff bathroom, not the student bathroom, right? And so when we kind of dig a little bit deeper, we see, oh, there is a lot of important information here in the lived experience that we just do not get when we don't release a little bit and share that decision-making power. And that goes across the board in our cities, in our organizations. We'll see that everywhere. And so trusting our communities to know what they need. And then next, what I would say is that the framework of participatory budgeting is designed to manage those expectations, right? And so that first step, which is the design phase, when our steering committee is coming together to design the process, they're going to decide what projects are eligible and what projects are not eligible. And so if you think that, I can only do this with this funding, maybe it's the Department of Health and your projects need to be focused on health, well, that's going to be part of your guidebook, and that's going to be in all your communications and all of your marketing so that people know this is the focus. And when somebody comes and they suggest, well, I want English classes for kids, you can say, oh, that's a great idea. That idea does not fit in the goals of our process. We cannot pay for that with the funding that we have for this project. But let's work together on this, and maybe we can work together on that because that's also a great idea. How can we find funding for that? All right, I have some best practices here, but I'm going to just move quickly over to impacts. And I'll just, because I think I want to leave you with some kind of exciting impacts here, which are to say that one of the things we see is that participants who participate in PB are more likely to vote in other elections. They're also more likely to have non-electoral forms of participation, right? So this might look like participating in a community board, in the parent-teacher association at their school. If they're young people, they might be more likely to participate in their student government. And so, people start to thinking, there are decisions being made and I need to be at the table in many other places, not just when I'm voting for the mayor or the president. We see more collaboration between organizations. Brian mentioned this, more funding redirected to low-income communities. And then this last one I like to share because people learn about public budgeting and finance. And so somebody might say, well, I want all new pavement on the sidewalks in the whole city. And they might learn through this process that that might cost like millions of dollars, much more than they thought it would. And it's a way for folks to repair a little bit of trust between the community and their government. When they say, oh, the government, they never do what I want. And they might realize, oh, it costs a lot to do everything I want, right? This is a way that folks can learn, repair trust, right? Kind of creating new ways to collaborate and work together. I'll end by sharing that we have a resource library on our website. It's participatorybudgeting.org. There's tons of resources here, case studies, templates, guides, an answer to probably a lot of the questions that you have. This is my email, and you can also follow us on social media. Thank you so much for having me. It's really a pleasure. I'm looking forward to our discussion.
Great. Thank you, Anita. Oh, sorry. Thank you, Anita, for the very, very insightful sharing. So you shared more about the PB cycle, which was really great because it was really a breakdown of all the key steps in it. Case studies, you were going through Taiwan, school-based processes and organizational-based processes, the challenges, the harsh reality of actually implementing PB, which I think we all learned a bit of the reality there, and the impacts of PB and why PB should even be considered in the first place. Thank you, Anita. So now we're going to hear from our discussant. Today, we have Mr. Wee Keng Boon, the General Manager of Marsiling UT Town Council in Singapore. So believing that residents hold the key to resolve the community's needs, Keng Boon has pioneered many innovations to facilitate communal solutioning in lieu of global and local trends. So in his own capacity, he is an associate faculty at Singapore University of Social Sciences and a PhD candidate at Singapore University of Technology and Design, specializing in township management and innovation implementation within the neighborhoods. He is also an implementation partner, recently appointed as our Action Fellow, responsible in co-leading, co-designing, and implementing a PB project that our own Future Ready Society team is hoping to launch at Marsiling UT area later this year. So let's get right to it. Maybe as a start, Keng Boon, can you share more about the work that you do and perhaps give a brief introduction about the PB project that we are working towards to give everyone some context? Keng Boon, please.
Hi, everyone. So Sohaila has given a brief breakdown of what I do, but at the same time, I'll also be sharing a bit more of how we are looking to include PB into our processes, as well as what are some of the current stands that we have towards participatory budgeting or even any form of active citizenry within the town council's aspect. So kickstart my session with just a very quick introduction, then we'll talk about a bit more on the participatory budgeting that we are embarking on. At this phase, we do not have as extensive of a portfolio as what the two speakers have shared. Prof. Wampler shared a lot in terms of what the municipalities can do. Then Ms. Anita also shared even more, including what citizens can then drive in terms of the things that they may look out for and in terms of how they balance their needs according to the budget that's set aside for even from the government agencies or even from, in our context in Singapore, for municipalities, which is the town council. So on this note, we also want to start with Forward SG. This is something that most Singaporeans may be already very familiar with. So within this exercise, more than 200,000 Singaporeans were brought together to discuss several topics. So these topics range very widely from careers to aging to environmental sustainability. So this is one example where in recent years, the government has adopted more of a consultative approach and in terms of towards the policies, and subsequently this will also bleed into how we then plan for projects. So this may include even URA's master plans, even for a green plan that we have launched. So in the government context, there's a very obvious shift towards consulting residents. So on the other hand, we also then look at the aspect whereby the living spaces of the residents. So that's more directly relevant to my work in the town council. So just a quick excerpt from HDBs, with more than 1 million flats built spread across 24 towns and 3 estates, and with 80% of Singapore's population being homeowners. So if you look at that context, you can see that in 2021, more than 4 million of our residents live within a HDB context. So that impact, if participatory budgeting is successfully implemented, can then drive up the living expectations, the living environment for our residents as well. So just a very quick introduction to town councils. As of 30 July, we have about 17 town councils. So that said, the town councils is also autonomous. Technically, town councils are not part of the government. So if you look at our website, it's not .gov, it's actually .org. Meaning that for us, we work very closely with the residents. There is a more direct link between us and the residents compared to, let's say, government agencies. At the same time, well, for town councils, we are also considered municipality. However, our scope is much narrower compared to municipalities overseas, whereby we do not have legislative power. We do not come out with laws, we do not come out with policies, but what we do actually manage is, in terms of our housing development boards, the estates within the housing development boards. So under the Town Council Act, what town councils do is control, manage, maintain, and improve the common property of housing estates of the Housing and Development Board. So this means that we are in charge of spaces, including the common walkway, including the multi-story car parks, as well as the sheltered linkways that most Singaporeans have come to be very familiar with. Then other areas includes the multi-purpose halls and whatnot. So town councils in our typical day-to-day work, what we manage are also the routine repairs. We do some town improvement and upgrading projects. This can also fall into the realm of building a new multi-purpose hall or creating a new community garden. And other than that, we also do cleaning services, then horticultural landscaping, as well as cyclical maintenance. So for cyclical maintenance, these are very routine upgrading set in terms of several year cycle. So for instance, a very visual improvement in terms of cyclical maintenance that we do is the repainting of the blocks that happens anywhere around 7 years. So while that said, these are fundamental roles of the town council, whereby we then work to continue maintaining and upkeep the estate. But at the same time, when the town council was first formed, we are looking at empowering the elected MPs, our member of parliaments, as well as the resident to work together to then create a town whereby it has its own distinct character. So as you move from town to town, you do see that there are times where different areas look vastly different from another town. There are rationale for it. So it also allows the residents to come in terms of the participating in the decision making. A very fundamental one where most residents who stay within a HDB estate may know is a selection of the color scheme. But of course, beyond that, we also have other participatory elements that we currently have in place. And participatory budgeting that we are currently looking at is even a step further to how we want to engage residents. So in recent years, we also do see trends in terms of community engagement, in terms of connectivity, which you can see in terms of linkways, in terms of more ramps, in terms of barrier-free access. We also then look at sustainability, whereby in terms of our processes, our operations, we have to be very mindful of the environmental impact, as well as even the biodiversity that we want to bring into our area. So this can include even some very signature projects such as the butterfly gardens or some biodiversity nodes, whereby different nodes can then bring in different kind of biodiversity. Because to ease our operation, we also have trends towards digitalization, meaning we want more work to be able to be done even without the manpower to drive the very laborious tasks. So in terms of estate inspection and whatnot, we also have then look at cameras, we look at how robots can then drive in terms of productivity. So these are some areas that we are looking at, but at the same time, we also want to ensure the safety and also the needs of our residents are always consistently met. So just a brief web of the stakeholders that the town council can typically deal with. We deal with government agencies, we deal with community partners, we deal with customers. So we also classify our residents, shop owners, even visitors to our estate. We also then deal with the political party, whichever political party we are working with. This falls back to the fundamental note for the town council to be a platform where the elected members and the residents can come together to make decisions regarding their estates. So with that said, town councils do have some participatory elements. One very key things that we look out for is actually the neighborhood renewal program, whereby residents are consulted throughout the process of the neighborhood renewal program. But this is still limited in scope compared to what we are trying to do in participatory budgeting. So for those that may not be familiar, for NRP, this is actually a project whereby it is fully funded by the government. It is implemented by the town councils. So in our role as an implementing agent, what we do is we facilitate the entire implementation of the neighborhood renewal program. So this includes from the planning stages, the budgeting stage, all the way to consulting residents when a first design has been out. So throughout that process, we also work with the working committee, which involves not only the HDB, it also involves our consultants, it involves resident representatives as well. So while this process works with specific groups of residents, there are groups where, similar to what the two speakers had mentioned, it's harder to reach out to. So for us, when we do our outreach during neighborhood renewal, we do also go through multiple platforms. So this can be digital. We still have to rely on paper to do some of the outreach because there are some of our residents that may not be as technically savvy. So we still have to have the person to really go down to the site and engage the residents through this. Then for NRP, it actually targets older blocks. So it is part of renewing the blocks within the estate. At the same time, it also then allows the precinct to be upgraded and to meet the new demographics. A case in point that we can look at, for instance, is as a young town starts off, it can have a lot of young families. But when young families grow older over the various decades, the children will grow older. The need for playground may be lesser, but the need for fitness corners may be more. So that at the very least, the parents who grow older, they also have a area whereby they can perform their exercises. So these are things that may change over time, whereby our town then needs to consistently be renewed to meet the changing needs of our residents. So in this process, the NRP also includes very common infrastructure upgrading that we do see. So sheltered linkways, community gardens, ramp staircases, this also ties in very closely with the trends that we have identified in terms of providing better connectivity and accessibility throughout the town. So even this year, it was already highlighted that over 95 million will be set aside to fund NRP projects. So the approach for NRP is quite standardized. We do have a few steps that we go through. So on the left, you would see a table whereby it's showing the steps that we have. Firstly, we do a design development. This is usually done with the HDB, the town council, our consultants, as well as representatives from residents. From there, a base design will be developed. Then a public consultation is done to the residents within the area, within the precinct. So from this public consultation, we will then let them critique in terms of what are some of the facilities that they deem has been implemented well, what are some of the design that they want to look out for. Is there any large issues that they require to be solved? From there, the design is refined. Before we go back to the next stage, which is consensus gathering, this is another stage of engagement. So this would then showcase the refined design that we receive from the public consultation. Then from there, the design is briefed, the final design is briefed to the residents. So at this note, we also then require 75% of the residents that are affected to actually agree to the project and the design that we go for. So 75% is a large percentage when we look at the grand scheme of things. But at the same time, it then allows us in the town council side to be very certain that our residents do want this to be implemented. So when we shift from this stage, whereby it's a consultation in terms of the design that is being done, in terms of the infrastructure that is being upgraded, what we want to do when I'm looking at participatory budgeting is for the residents to really understand what some of the hurdles that us within town council do have to go through. And in terms of planning our work, there are certain budgets constraints, there are certain regulatory requirements that we are looking out for. So with the better understanding, what we actually want to drive is that positive outcomes in terms of the impacts that both speakers have shared in terms of collaborating between residents and the municipalities as well as the MPs. So from this, some of the positive outcomes we do hope to achieve is for residents, a better and more holistic understanding of town council's work, also foster a stronger sense of community. Because through the COVID period, we do notice that there are groups that starts to be marginalized. There are residents who became even harder for us to engage. And this is something we do not want to drive throughout the community. So this bonding would also allow us to better understand the needs of our residents, and at the same time improves the residents' trust and relationship and confidence in town council. Because in engaging residents throughout the many public consultation, the consensus gathering, we do note that in many circumstances, well, like what Ms Anita has mentioned, there are times where residents wish for very big water fountain or whatnot that may not be that practical in terms of the grand scheme of things. But residents are very well aware what is their need. They may not be familiar with how the need can be achieved. So throughout the engagement process, a town council as an implementing agent can then understand what is the core need of the residents and work towards facilitating efforts in resolving these issues. So that would then bleed into the benefit that we do see in town council, whereby there's a clearer public priorities and preferences. So it's easier then for us at the town council to understand the needs of the resident and then prioritize accordingly. So this can be prioritizing in terms of resources, in terms of when the project comes out, and also in terms of what are some of the key things in terms, let's say in terms of trends or needs of the particular residents or the particular precinct. Then of course that would allow residents to be more satisfied with our services and increase the community ownership. There is also the other element where when we look at community ownership, we do see some of our facilities that are not as well maintained, or they may not be misused by residents. So the other part of it is if we then are able to drive the community ownership of the spaces, we are also very positive that with this increased ownership, the residents will take better care of the common areas. That would then drive down the operating costs for the town council, which effectively mean that we can then cater more budget towards better improvement for the residents. So there is all this impact that at the town councils and we are looking at. So even in the longer term, we want the people to be more informed and more active. There is a sense of belonging to the town that the residents stay in, which ties back to why the town councils were formed in the first place, which is to create a very distinct identity throughout the different towns. And in terms of community, of course, stronger civil society, as well as to enhance the community ownership. Then as residents start to be more involved, we can then have a better sensing of the needs of the resident rather than using just feedback as one of our parameters, but a very direct source of input from, let's say, the community champions or even residents on the ground. And for town council, of course, the better understanding of our demographics would then lead to a better infrastructure, as well as what I have earlier mentioned, to drive up in terms of how we can then reallocate our budget, allocate our resources to better work on improvement projects rather than just rudimentary day-to-day operations of maintaining or upkeeping our estate. So all in all, we do see that the PB would allow us to achieve all this impact. At the same time, we look forward to then learn from experts, including both of our speakers, in terms of how then we can engage our residents better. Then at the end of the day, it benefits all parties, all the stakeholders that are within this environment. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Kengun. Yeah, it was very thoughtful, and you were saying that it's still early days for us. We're planning to launch this year itself, but later this year. But I also want to relate it back to the insights that were shared by Professor Wampler and Ms Anita just now. So there was a part where both presentation actually covered on challenges and also best practices. So I was thinking that now seeing the Singaporean context and plans, right? Is there any advice that you would share in terms of safeguarding towards like mitigating challenges that we might face in the execution itself?
Sorry, Sue, could you repeat the question?
Oh, yes, definitely. So I think Kengun just gave some context on the plans that we're intending to do. So we're intending to conduct a PB in a town council district level. And Kengun shared some challenges such as community engagement, etc. And I know both the speakers' presentation also covered a bit about community engagement and other challenges. But are there some advice or best practices that you can share so that maybe in the Singaporean context we can take note of?
Great. Thanks for the question. Thanks for the presentations, both both presenters. Very useful and insightful. I think where I would sort of start, a key challenge is always the degree to which governments are going to invest in programs, even if the residents, the citizens, are choosing things that the government wouldn't choose themselves. So it's trying to figure out how to maintain the pressure on the government to follow through with their previous commitments. That's always a challenge in these programs. And I think sort of if governments can carefully sort of put parameters around how much resources are available and what is viable, then that becomes one way to move past that. I think a second major challenge is getting people to participate in a meaningful way. People have busy lives. If it's work or it's kids, there's a variety of different reasons. So I think one of the main issues is to try to think about what are the incentives. Is it, making sure the government follows through? Is it not over-promising? Like you don't want to promise too much. So I think it's really trying to think carefully about what are the incentives. I mean, one of the ways that I think about this participation incentives is these programs. I didn't really talk about this, but the programs work best when they work at two levels. They motivate people to participate when people see themselves as contributing to the greater good, like my community, my city, my nation, right? Something, I'm constructing something. So when it's something bigger than the individual, but it's also, they participate when it's very specific. My neighborhood, my street, my school, and trying to figure out how to merge those two, that's the real trick. But some of the best programs do that because they appeal to the greater good, the greater public good, but they also appeal to somebody's neighborhood and street level concerns and real self-interest. Let me stop there. So thanks.
Great.
Yeah.
Anita, yeah.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Brian shared. And I think I would add during implementation, I think throughout, right? And even thinking about wanting to repeat this cycle over and over, that community leadership is what provides accountability to processes many times. I think this is when the process itself is being implemented in terms of deliberation and project implementation too, making sure that that's happening in a timeline that makes sense and in the way that people really voted for and what really won. Having that strong base of community leaders is what's going to provide accountability. And I think to get that right there's community education that can happen, right? Making sure that people understand like what is happening, why is it happening this way, and what should it look like when it's done equitably, so that when it's not, they know to call it out. Another thing that comes to mind as the cycles are repeated is using money that matters, meaning that when we use money that's meaningful to people, that's one of the things that gets people engaged, right? And so I think that continuing to resource these programs in a way that's going to call out to people. So for example, like if we want to reach out to youth, like maybe it looks like connecting to like the schools and finding pots of money that I think relate to people and that are meaningful enough that they can fund projects that are going to have an impact on folks' lives, right? And kind of using that to guide advocacy when we're thinking about maybe looking at different pots of money or what's significant. And I think the last thing that comes to mind, I think in terms of implementation, my thing about projects is project implementation is what supports us in gaining trust, right? And I heard actually earlier today, this image for trust is not this like one thing that we can just call and it arrives, but it's like this series of small things. You said what you did what you said you would do once, and then you did it again and you did it again, and that's how we build trust. And if one of our goals is to build trust between people and institutions, when there is, you know, that winning project and it's implemented once, they say, oh wow, they said they did what they said they would do. They implemented this project that we chose collectively in this really unique, amazing way. And then you implement another project and you implement another one. And I think when we see processes that run for like many, many years and participation goes up, I think that it's part of gaining trust. And then people saying to their neighbors, well, look, I put that on the idea form and it's on our street, and like my neighbor did that, and wow. And I think that's how we gain trust, and that's one of the things that make processes successful too.
Yeah, to both speakers, I'm also wondering, in terms of the stakeholders that you are dealing with, which would be the most critical in terms of driving the success for PB?
So I think PB works well because it's both top down and bottom up. And you remove, if it's just government driven, people won't show up, people aren't involved, they don't feel ownership. So some of the things you were talking about earlier about people taking better care of the playground equipment or monitoring how it's being implemented, that doesn't happen. If it's only bottom up, then you end up with a government that may not necessarily be interested in implementing programs. And that's important because it's the whole bureaucracy that has to be mobilized, right? You know, if you have a PB meeting and there's money attached, but you haven't connected the public housing unit or the infrastructure division, if you don't have the state mobilized to the implementing agencies, then it won't happen. So I think, there's very many unique aspects of PB, but this is another one where it really depends on top down and bottom up. And that's difficult to sustain over time. But I think that's where you're going to see the success, where you sort of, you habituate bureaucracies to work with the public, they get used to it, and then the public learns about the policy-making cycle. They learn about how, when they need to get things in and what's a reasonable request. I think I would suspect a challenge in a city like Singapore, from the little I know, is that it's expensive and that it's really hard. It's like the budget available for extra projects is limited. That's been a huge project in New York City. It's a project in Paris. It's a problem in Paris where they just don't have it. They need tens of millions of dollars, hundreds of millions of dollars to solve some of the big problems, and some of the smaller scale issues don't work. So I think that's a challenge for these programs. But just to go back where I started, it's sort of it's being like it's recognizing that it's almost like this dance between society and government and trying to figure out how they can come together at certain moments in order to advance these programs. Remove either one and the programs don't work as well.
To answer your question, I think what's the most important stakeholder? I completely agree with Brian. I think that it's everyone is really significant to making PB successful. And what I would add to that is, if you are thinking from the advocacy point of view, right? When we're advocating for a PB process to be implemented before we have PB, I think it's about, getting in touch with like people's beliefs about what PB is, right? So sometimes I just start with like, do people understand what it is? I think there are things that have been called participatory budgeting that are not participatory budgeting, but that might just be other ways that governments invite people to like share their opinions. There's a whole spectrum, and it's not bad. Inviting people to share and give input into government decisions is great. But I think that sometimes people might think PB is one thing and it's something else. And so I think starting with like, everybody's on the same page about what is happening. And then I think thinking about what are people's fears really, right? Because sometimes it might be, there's not enough money to do this. There's not enough money to do participatory budgeting. We don't even have enough money to do the problems we already have, and that's going to take money away from the hospitals, for example. This is a rhetoric that we do see in places that are advocating for PB. And so I think it's about getting in touch with that and then just meeting that with truth. Sometimes it's something else. Sometimes it's decision makers who really do not see the point in sharing power, in sharing the responsibility to make decisions on the budget, and then we can target that, right? And so all stakeholders are important, but there might be a narrative that as advocates we can tease out to address, okay, what is it here that people are following that we can intercept and talk about PB in a different way.
Right. King Boon, any comments on that?
I think the inputs are very interesting. As both speakers mentioned, we really require the inputs from every stakeholder. What I do suspect is that there may be difficulty in terms of engaging residents, even within our internal stakeholders, but the impact of PB would be something worth our effort to really push through.
Great. Okay, so that is great for us to open the questions to the floor. So if you have any questions, please type them in the chat below or use the raise hand function to ask your questions directly to our speakers. But I saw a question previously by Chun Feng Hua.
MCCY.
From MCC, right? Yeah. Okay. If she doesn't want to, I'll just read it out.
Oh, sure, no problem. I think I can do that.
Yeah,
Thank you,
great.
Zuhair.
Okay. Introduce yourself first. Yeah, thanks.
Hello, I am Chun Feng from MCCY. Yeah, actually, I'm part of the team with Partners Portal, SGPO. Yeah, so actually, I was really intrigued by what you shared earlier on, Prof. Brian. there is this local champion in government. So I think across the three of you, there is this very strong emphasis on the need for someone to anchor or hold on to this partnership very strongly to see end to end, right? The whole process. But I also think this can be a very daunting thing to do because it could last for a very long time. So I just wonder, how then can we leverage on other partner agencies to make it less painful? And if it's possible, have you all encountered any way that you guys identify local, it could be non-profit community champions or organizations, right? Could we possibly leverage on them? Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, thanks for the question. I saw the written question as well. And I mean, I think like the strong champion, maybe plural champions as opposed to single champion. By multiple, like plural champions, you could, I think having a political representative is important. Somebody who was elected is really crucial as part of, they have as part of their mandate to do this, a mayor, a governor, or a city council member. I mean, New York's really, they did theirs on the city council district as opposed to citywide. So it was a really sort of sub-district, which sounds a little bit more like the town councils. But I think having full-time administrators or administrators who at least this is a big part of their job responsibilities is important. It can't just be one more thing that administrator does, but somebody needs to be tasked with the responsibility of carrying out the program and, organizing the meetings and working with leaders and the outreach. I mean, it is really time intensive. It takes a lot of effort. And so the successful programs have hours and hours dedicated to them, both staff time, official staff time, but also volunteer hours. And so it's also having partners in civil society. And that's where that goes back. I talked about a little of my presentation is that line. If the partner is too close, it could be like co-optation, but so there needs to be a little bit of distance, but having a partner is important to be able to, call, have the person who helps call to mobilize people to show up to meetings, who helps to set the agendas beforehand, who helps to like monitor implementation. So I think it's actually, so I think my slide probably should have been local champions in different types of champions. I think is really crucial to the process.
I'll add a few points to that. I appreciate this question, and I think there are a few different ways to address it. I think one example of a way that government agency implementing participatory budgeting has partnered with NGOs, community-based organizations, is the New York process is happening right now, and tons of other cities do this. Where if we're thinking about idea collection, for example, and voting, this government agency, even if it has like, I don't know, 20 staff members dedicated to PB, which I don't even think they have that many, that wouldn't be enough to implement PB in a city with 8 million residents like New York City. And so they partner with tons of community-based organizations. They design a curriculum for idea collection, and they train these staff members at the community-based organizations to run idea collection events where they have events. They're already these trusted messengers in the community. They probably have people in their offices all the time, and they say, oh yeah, and we're doing this thing. We're collecting ideas so that you can decide how to spend money in our city. And that's a way that New York City was able to collect a lot of ideas. Same goes for voting. These same organizations can be physical sites of voting where somebody is going to get their free lawyer assistance, free legal assistance, or their English classes, or their after-school program for their kid, and they can vote in a PB process. That's one way. Another way is that government agencies can just borrow staff from one another. We see this in Monterey, a city in California. The Department of Transportation was running a process, and the Department of Health, which is going to run a process very soon, they were tapped in, and they just worked very closely together to support with staff time, right? And they were able to do that because they had staff time. And the last thing I'll say to this question is, one way to tap into more capacity there is to rethink like how we do community engagement. And so is there an existing priority that PB can exist as like a model or an answer to, right? And so if there is already an office of community engagement and they're doing like 5 different projects, is PB a way that we can like channel all of our energy to meet some of the goals that we have, right? If our goal is to, I don't know, engage our community in X ways and X thing, that's a way. And we see that happening in Durham, North Carolina, a city in the southeast of the US. And New York City too, they have an office that's now exclusively dedicated to running a PB process.
Oh, thank you.
Great. And I see Justin having a question. Please introduce yourself first. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Justin from the Institute of Policy Studies, and I actually have 3 questions, and I'll ask them, and Sue can decide, how many you ought to answer. So the first question is the most vulgar. It's about money, and when we do pilot programs or we do programs, I've been asking the evaluators how much amount of the proportion of the program cost should be spent on evaluation. And people don't actually have a decent benchmark, but then I pushed them and they arrived at roughly, about 10%. If your program's going to cost 100K, 10% can be used for evaluation, no more than that. Much more than that would seem vulgar. So I have a similar question for PB. You have 100K, let's say, for PB. If 10% is for the evaluation, how much percent would it be another 10% for the implementation and the process of engaging citizens and all that? What would you say would be a decent amount that you put aside for the process itself? So that's my first question. The second question is, we're having this debate between King Boon and Suhaila. Should I gather that the public officials from Brian's talk should be involved in the process, but could they also be involved in the sharing of ideas, the developing of proposals, and even voting? Or should it only be residents, right? And I feel that, just involve more people. It's okay to involve the experts and the officials, but I don't know. The third question is, how much, in your experience, how much research and investment do the citizens spend? I think King Boon's hunch is almost like many residents are just going to show up and they're just going to, it might be even difficult to get them to come forward. And I probably feel the same. I go around, and if I had to decide between the color schemes of my HDB flat, it's such low stakes that I don't even want to show up. If the stakes were higher and my ideas can get implemented, my hunch is that I might show up. But the question is, I guess I'm thinking, how much do we invest in the process? Because citizens sometimes have very mundane ideas, right? You don't necessarily put them through an innovation or design thinking process so that their ideas can be cooked and developed and become wonderful. And so how much do you think we should invest in? We were just thinking, maybe we'll have student facilitators pair up with the residents and they can do some research on the side, and maybe they come up with better ideas or develop stronger proposals. Or should we just say, the residents can come up with whatever and let it be so? Or do you want to invest so that the residents have a chance to develop stronger and even more creative ideas? So those are the 3 questions. So do you up to you how you want to assign these questions.
Actually, anyone that wants to answer it, please feel free. Any of the speakers.
I'll jump in there again. So Justin, those are 3 great questions. And let me just start with the first one, answering a little bit different. Of overall total municipal budgets, most, let's say, successful programs will spend 3 to 5% of their discretionary funding on PB. So let's say you've got say you've got $1 million of discretionary funding for new investments. For the whole municipality, you're spending between 30 and 50,000 of that on a PB process. So that becomes meaningful. When Porto Alegre started, they were spending 15 to 18% of their entire municipal budget. So that's one of the reasons it was so successful, was they were spending a lot. But over time, that declined for a variety of reasons I can't really get into. But I would say that the majority of program money should go towards project implementation. The less that's spent on evaluation, the less that's spent on the process, the better. I mean, obviously there needs to be some on process, which goes a little bit to your second question, is if you give government officials the same opportunity to speak as residents, you're going to get government officials dominating the process, and nothing's going to change. And so I think one of the things that's unique about PB is it tends to create a space in which local residents who know their communities can identify what their issues and their problems are. In some places, government officials do speak, but oftentimes it sort of depends on the hierarchy. So this is, you know, like, what's the social hierarchy in these communities? If it's a really strong social hierarchy, then you'd probably not want to have the government officials speak, because they would just drown out what everybody else is going to say. So there's that creativity, there's the sort of the influx of new ideas. And in some ways, you could even think about this, when government officials may resist that this is actually a way for them to get new ideas that it's hard for them to get. So, you know, government officials, as you're in government, you get farther and farther away from the population. And this is a mechanism to actually overcome some of that. And then in response to your third one, I mean, that's a classic, great question. One of the things I said earlier, it's better to provide education to the community leaders than the actual residents, because community leaders already have a base and you want to build out, they're going to show up year after year. You know, and it could be, I mean, one of the things that I do like about the Paris example is that all these programs are put in, and they randomly select a citizens council to select the projects that then citizens will then vote on. So I don't know if I said that really well. Everybody enters the projects online. They randomly select a group of 10 to 15 participants to then select from that whole body a smaller number that they then vote on. Then the broader population then votes on. And that's a way to, I think it's sort of a mechanism of trying to filtering through ideas, letting ideas just flow out there. Some of them aren't going to work. Some of them are crazy. Some of them are just unrealistic, like the roller coaster. But I think it's still a mechanism to sort of like, how do we get people to participate? Because people know a lot more about their local communities than government officials do, although government officials don't really want to recognize that.
Absolutely, 100% agree. I'm going to put in the chat a link to a tool from our website. It's a municipal evaluation toolkit. I don't have an answer for you on percent of budget, but there are some guidelines here that we'd like to share. And I won't say too much more about that. I think Brian talked a little bit about evaluation. I'll just focus a little bit more on your last question about like, how do we support people in generating like good ideas, meaningful ideas, right? The kind of ideas that if you're designing this process, you're like, I want to see that happen, right? I think first it would be that, just reiterating what I mentioned earlier about like a little bit of letting go and trusting the community to know what they need. But I think then after that, there is a lot we can do when we're thinking about designing the spaces that people are going to come into, right? And so it can be a really simple form online that says, what's your idea for how to spend this money? Or it can be, you know, might take you through a little bit of like a learning journey of like, okay, this money can be spent on infrastructure. This money can be spent on programs and services. Like, think about, you know, your city, think about your day-to-day, what kinds of things would you like to see? When you do this in person, I think you can be even more creative. You can, if you have as a goal of the process to provide education to your community on the way that the government works, the kind of decisions that are being made, like you can include that. But I think more importantly, and I think what's more meaningful is to have people dive into, getting in touch with what their needs, because when you ask people like, what do you need? They know, I think, Brian says they may not know all the other restrictions. They may not know how much everything costs, but they know, right? And then I want to land this in talking about proposal development, which is when those ideas, which sometimes are not even a sentence, those ideas get turned into concrete proposals. And so I shared this in my presentation, but 24/7 bathrooms, it was an idea that was shared in Seattle. An 11-year-old kid shared this idea. It's not a sentence, it's just 2 words, right? And in proposal development, the volunteers, they might ask like, wow, we do have a lot of people in our city who are homeless. They might not have access to a bathroom. Okay, where are we going to put these bathrooms? How many do we need? Where are they going to go? What else do we need around this? And I think that grows. And that goes for any type of idea, infrastructure, program, service, whatever it is. There's a lot of spaciousness. Proposal development is the most time intensive, the most resource intensive part of the process, because it requires that component of taking something that's just a sentence and turning it into something really meaningful. And that's also where the projects like the roller coaster, that's going to get sifted out, whether it's going to get sifted out by the government official whose job it is to look through the projects, or by the budget delegate volunteers who are going to say, actually, I don't think this really meets a need in our community. We have so many other projects that meet needs. It requires a little bit of trusting the process, right, to work. And I think we can see that it has in so many places. That's what I would share.
Justin, any comments on that?
No, this is really wonderful, and I just wanted to reflect the insights that Brian and Anita have shared. That what's really interesting to me is that PB seems to have diffused, particularly because both sides of the spectrum, of the political spectrum, are supportive of it, whether it's for different purposes. But it's also so interesting that as Brian put it, it needs to be top down and bottom up at the same time. And people come out to participate because they're contributing to a greater good of the community or city, but also it serves their self-interest. So it seems to be such a nice package, it feels.
Okay, so let's have one last question from the floor. Anyone?
Can I ask a very quick question? We have time for one more question.
Yes. Go ahead.
Yes, sure. My name is Harvey. I'm from LKYCIC. Thank you for this very illuminating and exciting discussion. My question is something that's been raised several times, and that's on participation, specifically the kinds of people or how we approach people to participate in the process. I see that one way that we can do it is really to be fully democratized. So we go all out to get everyone who is in the area to be involved in this process. But I'm a bit concerned about such a strategy, although they are not compelled to join this process, but they may feel that by joining and it's a little bit not so relevant to them, they feel disengaged from the whole process and that therefore devalues PB. On the other hand, we could go for a little bit more targeted, so for instance, if this specific issue, we know beforehand that it will affect certain groups of participants much more, should we go, overdrive in encouraging them to be in the process, be part of the process, but in a way that doesn't exclude anyone else from joining? So I'm just concerned about how do we reach out to the right people. And my sense is that going all out may not actually be a good solution to this.
Harvey, that's a great question. Thanks for asking it. I think part of the way I would respond is to ask, what is the purpose of the participatory budgeting process? Are you trying to include people who don't have a voice? Are you trying to include people in a post-COVID environment who are no longer feeling connected? Are you trying to hear a representative range of voices from the community? Are you trying to reach out to people who wouldn't normally, who would normally go to city council meetings or town hall meetings. And so that would become the question of who do you want to participate? Because probably it's going to be a small subset. It's going to be 3, 5, 10% of your population, unless you do it digital and then you can grow. But if it's a small subset, do you want to have like identify different types of people who would be important to bring, combination of the elderly and the young and the employed and the unemployed, different, people from different ethnic groups, and then structure your program of sort of what it would look like to have the type of democratic participation that you think is important. I don't think there's a set rule. It's got to be everybody, or it's can only be these groups. But it's figuring out what's going to make the community stronger, what's going to make the society stronger, what's going to pull people together. I think might be a way to approach it.
Absolutely. And what I would add to that is when you have that answer of, what's the goal and who do I want to be here? If they are a group of people who have not been present at the table, which is typically what we see in PB processes, right? For us to see the kinds of results and impacts that we love to see with PB, right? There has to be that focused outreach. But then asking, why have these people not been at the table? And then when they arrive, how can we make it a space that they want to be in and that they can participate in, right? And so it doesn't just mean, making sure that we put flyers in that neighborhood. It might mean paying people for their time to be there, right? If they're going to be budget delegates, for example, doing proposal development, providing food, providing reimbursement for transportation, providing childcare, providing interpretation services, translating written materials, using simple language. In English, participatory budgeting is so many syllables, and even just saying that can be very isolating to people. It can push people away and make them feel like this is not for me. And so how can we design spaces that, when you do have that answer of, okay, who do I really want to be here? How do we make it a space where they feel like they do belong?
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Oh, great. So now, look at the time. We've come to the end of the learning journey. A great big thank you to our incredible speakers, discussant, and to all of you for your participation. We hope you leave this Zoom chat feeling inspired and educated with new ideas on PB. And if you're interested to find out more about the work that we do check out our Future Ready Society website at futurereadysociety.com. where you can also join our mailing list to stay tuned for more exciting events in our Future Ready Society conference series. And we do have another learning journey coming right up on the 18th of July on citizens' assemblies, panels, and juries. So stay tuned for that too. And we really look forward to your continued participation in our upcoming events. And with that, thank you and have a great day ahead.
Thank you,
Thank you.
everyone.
Appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for staying up. Have a good evening at your time zone.
Thank you so
you.
much.
Thank you so
you.
much, everyone. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Thanks, everyone, for attending.
Thanks, Kane Boon. Bye.
Thanks, Kim Boon. Bye.